Hi, I'm Bill, and I'm the content creator for visionandprophecy.com. And in this video, I want to cover a prophetic update. It's kind of a follow-up to, I think, my first video on my channel, where I just want to kind of go over all of the reasons that I've collected of why I think that the rapture of the church and the tribulation period are imminent. And that I've learned different things, new things that I want to add to my reasonings. I want to present some updates to some of the things that I presented in the past, little tweaks here and there. And I think that you'll find it rather compelling. So as far as an agenda for this video is concerned, I'm going to take a brief period of time just to talk about that the Bible explicitly states that the people that are watching for the coming of the Messiah and watching for the end times are to be considered wise. And then, like I said, I'll recap some of the things that I presented in the past, and I'll present some new things as well. So first, the wise are watching. Proverbs 25 verse 2 indicates that it's the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings to search things out. So this gives an indication that God does in fact conceal things, including in his scriptural texts. And it's to our glory to search for those things, to seek to know God and to know his word and to connect those dots. Likewise in Esther, there's wise men that are mentioned in chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. It says the wise men knew the times. They sit first in the kingdom and see the king's face. So there's honor that's associated with it, and those that are wise are attributed with the knowledge of the times. So they're recognizing the times in which they're in and the truth associated with that. Likewise, Matthew chapter 2, verse 1 through 12, this one's much more widely known, that there was a group of wise men who discerned the timing and celestial signs and potentially other signs of the coming of Jesus, the birth of Jesus, and then they traveled to Jerusalem seeking him and to worship him. Historical record indicates these were not Jews, first of all, but they came to worship the Jewish Messiah. I present in content on my website, and I think also in a previous video, that there's relatively likely that these were Zoroastrians that were probably influenced by Daniel and other Jewish prophets when they were in the Babylonian captivity. So they had access to biblical wisdom, it appears, and then that likely influenced what they were looking for when they found these signs, and then correctly discerned the time in which Jesus would be born, roughly speaking. Matthew 16, verse 1 through 3, the Pharisees and Sadducees are reprimanded by Jesus for being unable to interpret the signs of the times. So this is the flip side of that equation, is Jesus outright states, if you can't discern, if you can't interpret the signs of the times, that's not a good thing. You need to be able to see that. You need to be paying attention to that and understand your place in the timeline, so to speak. And then Matthew 25, verse 1 is the parable, or includes the parable of the wise and the foolish virgin. So this is a group of 10, call them a bridal party, effectively. 10 women who have lamps, and they're preparing for the coming of the bridegroom, which is part of the Galilean wedding tradition. Half of them have prepared in advance enough oil to last for the duration of the wait for the bridegroom to come. Meanwhile, the other half have foolishly not prepared enough oil, and when it comes time that the bridegroom comes, and of course, if you're familiar with Jesus' life and ministry, you'll know that Jesus calls himself the bridegroom, which is who we're waiting for. We're waiting for Jesus to come back and retrieve his bride. The individuals that are waiting for him, that are prepared and that are watching, they're the ones that go on to enter the wedding feast, the celebratory feast of the consecration of the marriage between Jesus, or the bridegroom, and his bride, the church. Whereas the ones that were not prepared, the ones that are not watching, that have to go and buy more oil for their lamps, they're the ones that are locked out. And I'll leave that to your own interpretation as to who those are. But it's clear that the wise are the ones that are watching and are prepared for the time. Now, the next thing I want to cover is why the teachings of the Sabbaths and the Jubilees in the Old Testament would indicate that timing is near. Starting a little earlier than Leviticus 25 and Leviticus 23, and earlier in the very beginning of the book even, God instructs the Jewish people to measure time in sets of 7, beginning first with 7 days in a week, with the 7th day being the Sabbath day of rest. Then, this is reiterated in Leviticus 23, which I'll show in a few moments. And then in Leviticus 25, God instructs the people to measure time not just in Sabbath weeks, but also in a Sabbath week of years. So a set of 7 years, 6 years of working the land and sowing it and reaping the harvest, and then a 7th year where you allow the land to rest. So I'm just representing that with 7 squares here. Leviticus 25 verses 8 through 12. It then indicates that not only are they to count weeks of years, but they should be counting sets of 7 weeks of years for 49 years total. And then on the 50th year, they're to proclaim a release throughout the land where all of the property is returned to the original owning family for anything that's maybe been sold. The rights have been sold for the Jubilee period or Sabbath week period or something along those lines. Elsewhere in the text, it also says that the Jubilee is to be associated with the release of captives and slaves and debtors. So those are all things that are associated with Jubilee, and obviously, particularly like release of debt and captives would be thematically associated with the end times. Okay, so we've got a Sabbath week of years, so 6 years working, 1 year allowing the land to rest, and they're to measure that in sets of 7 for 49 years total, and then the 50th year is a Jubilee. Now, Leviticus 25 also instructs that the people are to begin doing this counting when they enter the Promised Land. And you can deduce through the records that are in the Bible and secular historic records that the Exodus would have occurred in 1446 BC, and then the Jews wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years, and then they crossed the Jordan in 1406. I give a little bit of leniency here because there's probably some wiggle room with some of the events like spying and the events around Sinai and that sort of thing to potentially add a little bit more time, maybe another year or so, but generally speaking, you're looking at 1446 to 1406. Then, if you're just measuring Jubilees, you'll find that there are 70 Jubilees from when the people crossed the Jordan into the Promised Land, which is where God said to begin counting, to 2025, last year. And again, it's not the end of the Jubilee that is the celebratory year, but it's rather the first year of the next set. So that would be 2026. That's the year that we're in currently. And again, with some potential give and take as far as this particular approach is concerned, depending on how you might time some of the other events associated with the time between the Exodus and the crossing of the Jordan. What's really interesting about that is if you take it verbatim as how it's presented in the slide, you'll arrive at 3,430 years, which I have it notated there at the top, 3430. If you take 3430 and use that as a scripture reference, Genesis 34:30 has a mention of Jacob's trouble, which is one of the terms for the tribulation period, which it would seem is what the Jubilees are potentially counting up to based off of the count that I just presented in the previous slide. I included Jeremiah 30 here just as another entry for where Jacob's trouble is mentioned, just to give some more context of what exactly is associated with Jacob's trouble. In the Genesis 34:30, it's associated with enemies aligning together against Israel, which is found elsewhere in prophecy. And then in Jeremiah 30, there's Israel ultimately being restored, but there's also association with adulterous guilt and judgment being passed on Israel, which are all themes that are found elsewhere in end times prophecy. All right, let's talk about Millennial Days. Now, as I said earlier, I've covered some of this content before in previous videos, so you would find the Jubilee data that I've already covered and the Millennial Days data that I'm about to cover in one of my previous videos in greater detail. I would encourage you to go there if you want to find a little bit more about this approach to the text. But essentially, where you get the idea from Millennial Days is that Psalm 90 verse 4 states, "For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday, when it passes by, or like a watch in the night." So it likens 1,000 years to a single day. Meanwhile, 2 Peter 3 verse 8, Peter tells the church in the context of the end times, discerning the end times, that it's important to remember that with the Lord, one day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like one day. So we take this prompt from Peter as an indication that we need to take that statement in a literal sense and see what happens with the text as a result. So an example of what happens is if you go and read the account of Adam way back in Genesis chapter 2, you'll see that God commands Adam that he can eat of any tree of the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for on the day that he eats of it, he will surely die. Now, God's not a liar, but Adam did not die in the 24-hour period in which he ate the fruit. And we find in Genesis 5:5 that Adam actually lives to be 930 years old. Now, notice that 930 is 70 years less than 1,000 years. So it's 70 years less than one millennial day. And so therefore, what God stated is true in a physical sense for a millennial day, that on the millennial day that Adam ate of the fruit, he died. And this is not to discredit the notion that Adam eating the fruit is dying in a spiritual fashion. I think that there's also legitimacy to that. There's more than one correct way to interpret the things that are going on here, in my opinion. There's actually, I think, many verses that are like that, that there's more than one correct interpretation. They're not exclusive, mutually exclusive. They're actually cohesive. They're describing multiple realities with the same words at the same time. Continuing on just a little bit in the Genesis account, Genesis 2, verse 1 and 3, is where God establishes the Sabbath, where he himself takes a seventh day of rest and consecrates it. Then it gets immortalized in the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, and it shows up again in the law in Leviticus 23. Why I'm highlighting the Sabbath is that as far as the millennial days are concerned, it's the pattern of 6 1,000-year days of work, and then a 7th Sabbath millennial day, 1,000-year day. And that 7th millennial day is found in Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 6, particularly verse 4, where it mentions that Jesus will reign on earth for 1,000 years. So we have 6,000 years of mankind's kingdoms, and then we'll have 1,000 years of Jesus has returned and now he is reigning on earth as the millennial day Sabbath, so to speak. Now, another cool confirmation of this approach to the text is that found in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 8, and particularly verses 2 through 8. There are 28 times, quote unquote, that are mentioned. So just as an example, a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill, a time to heal. So it just goes on for 28 of those. Because it's talking about times, and we're talking about discerning the times, and there are 7 verses here that communicate periods of times for different things, there seems to be some correlation here of that 7 pattern to discerning the times. But where this gets really interesting is if you, I would encourage you to watch the video of the address that I have linked here. You'd have to type it in because you won't be able to click the link. And I'll try to remember to put the link in the description of the video also for ease. But Rabbi Lawrence, who's a Jewish rabbi, is the one that highlighted this chapter to me in this section of verses. And the way that he presents it in his video is the Jewish perspective. And he starts with the Jewish traditional teaching that there will be 6,000 years from creation to the Messiah, which is amazing, first of all, because that happens to align with the millennial day theory from Adam to us 7 years from now would be 6,000 years. And that should be the line of the transition from our current age and into the millennial reign age. So I actually would agree as far as the 6,000 years are concerned, but obviously they're not counting Jesus, right? They're not seeing Jesus as the Messiah. So what he's claiming is that there will be 6,000 years until the Messiah comes for the first time. And that contained within that 6,000 years is the reign of the Messiah. So he takes the 6,000 years and he divides it by the 28 times that are present in the 7 verses. He ignores the fact that it's 7 verses because that doesn't fit the narrative of the 6,000 years, I guess. But he divides the 6,000 years by the 28 times, and he gets 214 years average per time. And there's some change also. He actually, in the video, goes down to the actual day, which is amazing. But that's not really necessary for the sake of what I want to illustrate here. Is that, okay, so what he ultimately gets to, though, is that he says that if you take that 214-year average and you subtract it from the expected 6,000-year traditional total, you will land at 5,786. And that happens to be the current Hebrew year as of September of 2025. So in the video, he is making the argument that the Jews should be expectant in this current time frame because the Old Testament seems to have a typological pattern. Actually, I guess it's not typological in this instance, but it seems to have a foreshadowing pattern of the current Hebrew year being aligned with the revealing of the Messiah. And you can actually, if you just do a little bit of Google searching, you will find that there are other Jews that share his belief for other reasons, that now is the time to be watching for the Messiah. Little do they know that they're pretty spot on. They're about 7 years off from the millennial reign, or they're directly spot on if they're looking for the rapture. Because my expectation is that the rapture would happen before tribulation, and my expectation is that the tribulation period would be done before we reach the 2,000-year anniversary of the crucifixion. And we're very quickly running out of time for that, but we're actually, as I say, we're running out of time. What I actually mean to say is that we're actually approaching the point that would make the most perfect sense in that idea of 2,000 years from the crucifixion, and then subtract 7 years from there. We are right on the cusp. The other thing I wanted to say about this, and then I'll move on, is I find it amazing and fascinating that the Jews can interpret this selection of text in one way, and the Christians can interpret this text in a different way, and they both end up pointing to the Messiah and the current time frame. But again, the distinction is that the Jews are expecting the Messiah, a different Messiah. They're not expecting Jesus. So it's amazing to me how the text can be used in such a way that it actually continues the misdirection that the Jews have been operating in for the last 2,000 years. It should stare them right in the face that there are 7 verses here, and that the 6,000-year assumption is an incorrect approach. But they don't see that, and there's some blindness that's there. But this is actually going to feed into at least some Jews, their expectation of the Messiah coming for the first time, it not being Jesus, and then that will ultimately kind of lead into some of them being deceived by the false prophet and the Antichrist. Meanwhile, this confirms the Millennial Day theory. It's a supporting selection of scripture for the Millennial Day theory, and seems to line up just perfectly with the immediate time frame. So I've been talking about Millennial Days, but I didn't actually give you a visual. So here's the visual. Just shows the ranges of each individual Millennial Day. There is a little bit of time that is before the first millennial day, because the idea is that this millennial week is the work effectively that God is doing to resolve the problem of sin, to restore creation from the initial created state before Adam and Eve eat of the fruit, which is represented by the red square on the left side of the initial line of the timeline. And then we have the different dispensations, the different millennial days, culminating with the purple section, which is the millennial reign. Green having Jesus' life and ministry there. So this kind of helps depict it. There's one additional verse that's highlighted here, which is Hosea 6:2. I won't cover it any more than just to say that it also looks to support the millennial day theory, and specifically looks to reference the time frame from the crucifixion and the end of the fourth millennial day to the beginning of the millennial reign as the 2 days in which God will revive Israel. So God's going to revive Israel within this time frame, which we know to be true in 1948. And then on the third day, God will raise Israel up, indicating an elevation, an ascension, a improvement of status during the millennial reign, which makes perfect sense because there's a covenantal promise, right, for the Jews associated with Jesus reigning on the throne. So that's it for Millennial Days and Jubilees. If there's anything else that you'd potentially want to see in regard to those, I have another video that has a lot more detail associated with that. The next thing I want to cover is Israel being reborn. So in Matthew 24, verse 32 and 34, Jesus is teaching, and he says to look at the fig tree to learn its lesson. And the fast version of this, the 1,000-foot view of what Jesus is saying here, is that the fig tree is equivalent to Israel. And I give 4 scripture references at the bottom of the slide there that are where you could find the proof for that. So Jesus is saying, look at Israel, see Israel. As soon as its branch becomes tender and it puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. Now, I'll give a little more emphasis to the summer part in a later slide, but as far as the purposes in this moment, the idea is that I want to communicate that Jesus is saying we look at Israel to get an indication of the season in which the end times are being fulfilled. And he even goes so far as to say that the generation that sees these things beginning to take place will not pass away. So if we then take that in a literal sense, Israel begins to, or Israel is very suddenly revived in 1948, and the generation that saw that take place is progressively disappearing now. They're slowly dying off. But we have a promise there in verse 34 that generation will not fully pass away before the end times begins. So it implies that our current time frame is approximately right as far as the end times would be concerned. Now, there's some other things to say. So first, I've already highlighted Israel would need to be a nation again, based off of the verse that we just read. That happened in 1948, and that generation is not going to pass away. Same chapter, Matthew 24, but in verse 7 it says, "For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places, but all these things are the beginning of birth pains." We've already seen nation rise against nation, World War I and World War II. That came directly before Israel becoming a nation again. So that kind of helps to give another confirmation that Israel being revived in 1948 is the marker, and the wars also serve as the marker of the beginning of birth pains, the beginning of the end, as far as the end of the prophetic events are concerned. Not the end of the world. We've got a 1,000-year reign of Jesus, right? As far as it mentions famines and earthquakes, I just highlighted in here that there are 22 countries that are currently considered to be famine hotspots, and I'll touch on current events a little more later, but current events suggest that famine's actually going to get worse rather than better in the near term. Likewise, the average number of earthquakes per year has tripled in the last 2 decades, and I know that in the last couple of months in particular, the number of higher magnitude earthquakes seems to be increasing. So the frequency of earthquakes and intensity of earthquakes seems to be increasing. So that also would kind of be a checkbox as far as what Jesus communicated. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. Another thing that we can pull from the other prophetic texts is that Israel in the end times is likely to be in trouble with other nations around the end. And the reason why is that scripture like Ezekiel 38 and 39, Daniel 9:27 mentioning the covenant, Ezekiel 30 and 39 mentioning an alliance against Israel, Psalm 83 mentioning an alliance against Israel, Genesis 34:30, which I highlighted earlier, tied to Jacob's trouble and enemies being aligned against Israel. These all consistently are communicating the same thing, that Israel's got some trouble happening when the end comes, and particularly, specifically, Jacob's trouble found in Genesis 34:30. So Israel will have trouble with an alliance of nations against it in the tribulation period. And that's effectively what we see happening in the news right now, right? Like the United States is the main friend of Israel, so to speak, in the current geopolitical circumstances. And everybody else is at least, cold towards Israel and their cause, wanting to kind of resolve what's happening with Gaza and resolve what's happening with the Golan Heights, the Palestinian state. The world is kind of against Israel predominantly, not entirely, but predominantly. So that seems to be the case in our current time frame. Matthew 24 and Revelation 11 indicate that the Temple Mount will be trampled by the Gentiles and defiled by the abomination of desolation. So the implication of these two things is that the temple would exist, the Jewish temple would exist again, which it currently doesn't. The Dome of the Rock is on the Temple Mount instead. So I know there are some people that speculate that the Dome of the Rock is going to be destroyed. Some people speculate that the Jewish temple will be built alongside the Dome of the Rock. I don't necessarily have an opinion on that. I just have the opinion that the third temple, which is described in Ezekiel 40, and has not existed, but has dimensions described in Ezekiel 40, that temple is going to exist at some point in a physical sense. And it doesn't make too much difference to me whether or not it replaces the Dome of the Rock or is built alongside it. I just believe that it's going to exist for the sake of fulfilling the prophecies that are communicated in Matthew 24 and Revelation 11 and other places. Another thing that's going to happen is in Matthew 24 and Rev 12, believers are going to flee Jerusalem and or Israel because of the abomination of desolation, which would be at the midpoint of the tribulation period. So we're not there yet, and wouldn't really see development for that other than the conflict that I've already highlighted. Alongside the notion that the temple would need to be rebuilt, the reason why it needs to be rebuilt is because Israel would want to be in the position to be offering sacrifices and offerings, and they prophetically need to do so in order to fulfill prophecy, because the prophecy includes the statement that the sacrifices and offerings will be taken away from Israel, and they're not currently practicing them. So that's something to expect as well, alongside the temple being rebuilt. And I can say that if you do a little research as far as the Temple Mount is concerned, Israel has progressively been pushing its limits as far as control over the Temple Mount is concerned, and what's allowed there and what's not, and making various governmental or legislative declarations of authority and dominion rights over the Temple Mount. So they're definitely progressing in that sense, and have been for years, towards something happening on the Temple Mount, one way or another, that will result in presumably a third Jewish temple. Second to last bullet, Messianic prophecy and covenant made between God and Israel's forefathers include Israel will multiply and ultimately rule with Jesus. So the expectation is that that's coming at some point here. And then finally, Jacob's age, because Jacob is later renamed to Israel, and just generally foreshadows and represents Israel symbolically. Jacob's age seems to be a foreshadow to the age of the nation of Israel in our modern day, when the tribulation period will begin. So let me show you what I mean by that. I'm not going to read all this, but the fast version of it is that when Jacob is working for his uncle Laban, and he has decided to work for the right to marry the daughters of Laban, when he first meets his daughters, Jacob is 77 years old, and I've got the logic there in the sub bullets of how you arrive at that conclusion, using various scripture selections from Genesis, and then a little bit of logic. Effectively, you can arrive at that Jacob was 77 when he met Rachel and Leah. He worked for 7 years to earn the right to marry Rachel, who was his chosen bride, but instead he is tricked by Laban and marries Leah instead. And then after some dialogue, the agreement arrives that he is to finish out the marriage week with Leah, which is a reference to the marriage custom of usually a 7-day wedding feast that kind of is the culmination of the engagement between the two, and signifies at that point in time that they're officially married. So Jacob is called to finish the marriage week with Leah, and then he would then be allowed to marry Rachel also, but the expectation would be that he would work for another 7 years. Ultimately, he ends up working for 20 years for Laban, which is part of the logic of how you arrive at his age in the first place. But this looks to be a foreshadow or a typological pattern for Israel and the church and Jesus, where the expectation that we have now is that Jesus describes himself throughout his ministry as the bridegroom and the church as the bride, and he communicates that he is going to go to his Father's house in through death and then ascension, and will prepare a place for his bride, just like the Galilean wedding traditions, and that then he promises to come back and collect his bride and take her, the church, to the place that he has prepared for them to dwell together. And the implication, because of the Galilean wedding traditions, is that there would then be a 7-day period of feast, and we actually find the feast in Revelation 20. I realize I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit on the slides here, but that's all right. You pause if you want to read the notes. I'm just going to explain the thinking behind it. So the idea is that the first 7 years that Jacob works represents the church age, from the crucifixion to effectively now, or 7 years from now, somewhere in between. And the reason for the 7 there, obviously, was 2,000 years from the crucifixion to now, but the reason for the 7 there is that the church is represented in a couple of different ways early in Revelation with the number 7, including 7 letters to the churches, 7 stars, 7 angels, all have association with the church. So that is the reason, I think, for the first 7 years correlating to the 2 millennial days of the church age. Leah, being representative of the church or symbolic of the church, is the first bride. She's unfavored. It's not the one that Jacob was choosing, but Jacob is denied his choice bride, Rachel, and instead is tricked, quote unquote, into marrying Leah. Now, obviously, Jesus wasn't tricked, but symbolically, Leah is the unfavored bride, whereas the church would be the equivalent of that. We're not the chosen people of, the Jews, but chosen nonetheless to be a bride. Other similarities is that Leah is fruitful from the beginning. She immediately starts producing offspring, and likewise the church is immediately fruitful upon being established by Jesus. And this is in direct contrast to Israel, that is criticized for being unfruitful and even cursed through representation of the fig tree for being unfruitful at first. But the Bible also prophesies that Israel will eventually be fruitful, will eventually be producing faithful, righteous believers. The one more pattern that helps confirm Leah is that Leah is ultimately buried, and Jacob is ultimately buried in the same tomb as Leah. So they're buried together, just as the church dies and is resurrected in Christ. That's not applicable to Rachel in the same sense, who's being symbolic of Israel for the sake of the tribulation period and the church age. So Rachel likewise is not buried in the same tomb. She is buried in a tomb on the roadside near Bethlehem. And I already mentioned that she is the favorite bride. She's the second bride, so the marriage for Rachel waits for the 7 of Leah's wedding week to be completed. So the waiting then is, the Leah's wedding week, and then the second 7 years that Jacob works is one of the periods of time that is referred to as Jacob's trouble, and it's because Jacob has effectively been tricked into working another 7 years to earn the wife that he thought he was working for the first 7 years. And there's other difficulties that arise during that second 7 year period, including but not limited to jealousy that Rachel has for Leah, because Leah is fruitful and Rachel is not. And that same type of jealousy will be, it maybe already is, maybe you could kind of make a little bit of an argument for that, but definitely will be the case for the Jews being jealous of the Christians during the 7 year tribulation period, when the church has been raptured and the Jews have to come to terms with the fact that they missed the actual Messiah, that the Christians were right this entire time, and now they find themselves in a 7 year tribulation period. There's going to be a lamenting, and the kind of core underlying emotion of that is jealousy of what's happened with the church versus what the Jewish people are expecting prior to the rapture occurring. So the general sense of what I would want you to take away from this is that Israel, in many different ways, in many different facets, is a indicator of the timing of the end times, and that began with World War I and II, and then ultimately 1948 when Israel becomes a nation again. And now what we've been doing is time has been progressing to Israel maturing to the appropriate age to match the typology that's found in the story of Jacob acquiring his wives. I'm going to change gears a little bit here. The sections that I presented so far have been different approaches to identifying the general season of years, like what kind of year range would we expect the rapture / tribulation period to occur. This approach is going to highlight some scriptures that seem to point to a particular season of the year being spring, but not necessarily a particular year per se. So starting with Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 10 and 11, it says, "My beloved speaks and says to me, arise, my love, my beautiful one, and come away." So that sounds a whole lot like the kind of bridegroom relationship that I was just describing. And then in verse 11 it says, "For behold, the winter is past, the rain is over and gone." So if Jesus is coming to get his bride, he's telling his bride, arise and come away. That sounds like rapture, and the statement is that winter has passed at this point. The bride is to recognize that winter has passed, which implies that spring has begun. Isaiah 28, verse 3 and 4, it says, "The proud crown of the drunkards of Ephraim which is the territory north of Jerusalem, will be trodden underfoot. So that's seeming to indicate that perhaps an invasion of some kind. And then in verse 4 it says, the fading flower of its glorious beauty, which is on the head of the rich valley, will be like a first ripe fig before the summer. When someone sees it, he swallows it as soon as it is in hand. So what I think this is alluding to is the tribulation period, where we know from like Revelation 11, for example, that the Gentiles are going to trample a portion of Jerusalem, specifically around the temple, and which implies that there's going to be some form of invasion. And this selection of scripture seems to indicate that Ephraim would be first in that conquesting, or that problem, that conflict, and that it's likened to the first ripe fig before the summer. So obviously I've already covered that Israel is the fig tree, and so it makes sense that it's speaking of fig fruit specifically in relation to Israel, and it's saying that Ephraim will be the first fig before the summer, implying that this is happening in the spring, which would correlate the beginning of the tribulation period to spring, and specifically to Ephraim being conquested in some fashion, or at least in conflict. Zechariah 14 verse 6, which by the way, Zechariah 14 is speaking of the second coming, so I want to be clear on that. But this sort of indirectly confirms what the previous two verses confirm, is that the second coming, on that day, there shall be no light, cold, or frost. And why would it be so specific about cold or frost weather if it's not to be expected? So the implication is that it's transitioning out of a season of cold or frost, and is transitioning therefore into spring. This is the second coming, so it would be at the end of the tribulation period. But if the tribulation period begins in the spring, and then you do 7, not quite, but essentially full years later, because it's actually prophetic years, not Gregorian years, 360-day years, not 365, you'll still, if you start in the spring, you will more than likely land also in the spring. Especially the deeper you get into the spring before tribulation starts, the more likely that tribulation would also end in the spring. Similar vein, in Matthew chapter 24, verse 20 and 21, Jesus is speaking, and he warns the people that are in Judea to flee when the abomination of desolation is present in the holy place. And then in verse 20 it says, pray that your flight will not take place in winter. If we've got a trib start in the spring, kind of depending on where exactly trib were to start in spring, you would have a midpoint that would kind of either be in the fall or in the winter, which would then make sense why that Greek word for winter, which could also be translated to like stormy or gloomy, nasty weather, inclement weather, it would make sense why Jesus is saying that you'd want to pray for good weather during that time frame, because it's going to be a part of the year that has the potential to not be so pleasant when you're trying to flee the abomination of desolation and the resulting wrath that's coming as a result of it. Also in Matthew 24, I've got a couple other selections here. Verse 32 and 33, Jesus again is indicating, look to the fig tree. And I mentioned this earlier, that it says, you know that summer is near. Now the Greek word for that is hoti, and it's not just saying you know summer is near. You can't actually take the that out of there, because that word hoti is indicating a very specific summer is near. So it's specifically indicating that the fig tree is going to be an indicator of when the summer that's associated with tribulation would begin, and the very beginning of that tribulation period, evidenced with the previous verses, would actually begin in the spring. But this verse is pointing to the summer, in which tribulation is at that point in full swing. This is how I'm interpreting that. Matthew 24 verse 40 to 41 also mentions, in regard to the rapture, that it'll be like two men being in a field, one taken and one left, or two women grinding with a hand mill, with one being taken and one being left. The hand mill is the significant part here. They wouldn't be milling anything unless they were harvesting grain, specifically harvesting. Otherwise, you don't have anything to mill. If you're sowing the field, you're not milling. So it implies specifically harvest. Both the barley and the wheat harvests happen in the spring in Israel. So this little depiction of the rapture seems to indicate that the rapture would occur in the spring, sometime around harvest. You can make an argument about which harvest. The barley harvest is earlier in the spring, whereas the wheat harvest is later in the spring. But definitely appears to be in spring. I want to highlight also the Levitical feasts, Leviticus 23 feasts, where there are 3 Jewish feasts that occur in the spring. They all occur within an 8-day span, beginning with Passover on the 14th of Nisan. And then 50 days from the Feast of First Fruits, which would be the first of the week that falls within that Passover week. 50 days from that day is the Feast of Shavuot, which is technically also in the spring. So why I bring this up is just that for Passover, we see in hindsight and historically that significant events related to Jesus occurred during the Passover week, and that the symbolism of the feasts and how the Jews were told to observe the feasts, that symbolism turns out to be foreshadow of different aspects of what happened to Jesus, him being sacrificed on the cross as the sacrificial lamb, and Passover has a lamb that is sacrificed. Jesus's body being broken for the church is observed as bread, and it's unleavened bread because he's sinless. The Feast of Unleavened Bread then proceeds after Passover, and Jesus is described in various verses as being the first fruits of the resurrection, and the resurrection occurring on the first day of the week that follows the Passover, crucifixion, Passover day, Resurrection Sunday is what I'm trying to say, correlated with the Feast of First Fruits. So Jesus sort of fulfilled, so to speak, these feasts in that he was the ultimate culmination of the reason why God told the Jews to observe the feasts the way that he told them. He was calling his shot. He was being prophetic when he described how they should observe the events, but he didn't tell them why they were going to observe those. That became apparent in hindsight once Jesus did the things that he did. I'm telling you all this just to say that the fourth feast, the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot, is also in the spring. It might correlate with the Holy Spirit coming on the church. So it could correlate with the beginning of the church age, and therefore it could also potentially correlate to the end of the church age. Also, if you were to kind of consider these feasts as a timeline, but then zoom out that timeline to the 7 millennial days, you would have a winter period where the year starts, that there are no feasts. Then you've got spring, and you start having feasts, and that would kind of be roughly the time frame in which Jesus' ministry is occurring. And then by the time you get to late spring, you've progressed into Shavuot territory, which would maybe correlate with the middle of the 7 millennial day timeline. And then you'd have 3 final feasts that would correlate to the end of that same timeline, being the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. So you would find fulfillment for those things later. Those seem to all be associated with judgments and atonement. And then Tabernacles is dwelling with God once again, which makes perfect sense for it to be the last feast to be fulfilled, because that's the ultimate goal of the timeline in the first place, is to atone for sin, and then reconcile creation unto God, to dwell with God directly again, just as was the case in the garden before the first sin. So I just want to point out that these feasts can kind of correlate with the same kind of season timing that I'm talking about. I need to move faster. Okay, so moving quickly, I'm going to talk about some celestial signs here that I think are admittedly a little on the squishy side. When you start talking about celestial signs, it's definitely much more interpretive than some of the other things that I've presented here, but I feel that they're worth mentioning. So first, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 14, God says, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate day from night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years." So we get an indication in Genesis that the lights in the sky are, at least in part of their functionality is to be utilized for the discernment of times, for the understanding of times. We know that that was the case for the wise men that visit Jesus when he's born, or shortly after his birth, that they were using celestial signs to give them an indication of the time. So we've got some establishment of this concept in the text in a couple of different places. Now, in Revelation 12, verses 1 and 2, it communicates that there's a great sign in heaven, and it describes a woman clothed in the sun with the moon under her feet. A head has a crown of 12 stars, and she's pregnant, and she's crying out in labor. And labor and birth pains, like in Matthew 24 and elsewhere, are associated with the tribulation period. So this is giving some kind of an indication of a sign of the tribulation period in a celestial form. It happens that in September of 2017, on the 23rd, there was a planetary alignment that would match the description of what's found in Revelation 12. Now, obviously, the tribulation period didn't start in that year, but it could be that you could make an argument that this appearing, being a once in 7,000 years alignment of the planets, is a pretty unique thing, and maybe indicating the season in which the tribulation period was going to start. And at this point, you're effectively looking at around a 10-year warning for this to be applicable. So it might be too much of a stretch, but the placement of the planets and the Jupiter being the king planet, kind of representing Jesus in that sense, going retrograde in the abdomen portion of the Virgo constellation, while the planets are in the constellation of Leo, sort of forming a 12-star crown. It's a pretty unique celestial event that happens to align with the chapter. So maybe it's an indicator of the season. There's another sign that's also mentioned in Revelation 12 in verses 3 and 4, which describes a red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on its heads were 7 crowns. It sweeps stars out of the sky and hurls them to the earth. And a little later in the chapter, it actually it states that the dragon is hurled to the earth himself. And that happens specifically at the midpoint of the tribulation period. You have 1,260 days of the woman fleeing the first half, and then you have the dragon being thrown down, and then you have another period of fleeing, which I think is described as a time times and half a time, which correlates to 1,260 days also. So anyway, the dragon sign is kind of firmly in the middle then of the tribulation period as a result of that interpretation of Revelation 12. And what we see in the constellations is something similar. We have a couple of different instances of snake constellations, one being Ophiuchus and serpents, with a crown being the corona borealis above the head of the serpent. So in this sense, the serpent has a crown, but that's just kind of always there, right? Like there isn't anything that's really changing about that. And so it could just be a reference to where you're going to find the woman for the sign that I just showed. But if we were to assume a 2026 beginning of the tribulation period, we would then arrive at a 2029 midpoint. 3.5 years later. And in 2029, there will be a asteroid that will pass by the Earth. It's named Apophis, which, by the way, correlates to a Egyptian snake demon god of destruction and I think chaos, which should sound pretty familiar. That asteroid is going to pass closer to the Earth than any object of its size ever has in recorded human history. So it is a unique, singular event that is going to happen roughly in the time frame that seems to correlate with the midpoint of the tribulation period. And if the tribulation period were to begin on Passover this year, then 1260 days from Passover would be Rosh Hashanah in 2029. And then if you were to count backwards 150 days from Rosh Hashanah, which would be 5 30-day months, then you arrive at April 13th, April 14th, which is when Apophis would pass by. Why that's significant to me is both in Revelation 8 and Revelation 9, there are two different events that describe a star falling from the heavens and striking the earth. And in one of them, the result of that is that a pit opens up that then has demonic association. That could potentially correlate with the other bit of text or scripture that I've already mentioned, Satan being thrown from heaven in Revelation 12 to the earth, and Satan being a fallen angel, and elsewhere in the text, angels being likened to stars. What you have potentially is a description of a star being thrown to earth, and symbolically and maybe somehow physically also correlated to Satan being thrown to the earth at the same time. And we have a singular event of an asteroid coming closer to the earth than any other object of its size ever has, closer than the path that some of the satellites utilize to orbit the earth in the first place. So this thing is going to get very close. And from what little I know about asteroids, the science around asteroids and their trajectories, I do know that when an object is traveling an extremely long distance, like this asteroid is in space, any slight adjustment to its trajectory can have a very massive impact to where it actually ends up passing further down its trajectory path. So right now, Apophis is not very close to Earth. If it were to, react to heating from the sun, for example, and maybe off gas, or I've read that even just the heating and cooling of an asteroid as it makes its orbit around the sun can cause some level of alteration of its gravity field and how it's affected by gravity, which can, again, sort of be a small amount of change can be exponentially larger when you're talking about such a great distance that these objects are traveling. So my point being, particularly with off-gassing, there's the possibility for an unexpected adjustment of the trajectory as we get closer to time. And while this object is not currently projected to strike the Earth, there would be the potential of some kind of an adjustment like that, ultimately resulting in this object striking the Earth at a time that seems to be appropriate for prophecy, if it's correct that we should expect the tribulation period to be beginning imminently. So hopefully you got all that. One more constellation celestial sign. This one is not actually described as a sign in the text. Revelation 6 verse 1 through 2 is the first seal. So it's the first kind of prophetic event that's described at the beginning of the tribulation period. And what's described as a rider on a white horse with a bow is given a crown, and he goes out conquering and to conquer. Well, it's not described as a celestial sign, but it happens that on January 1st of this year, or December 31st, same time frame, there was a similar instance of a planetary alignment in the head of Sagittarius, which is not a rider but a centaur, but you could interpret it potentially as a rider on a horse if you were just use different art but the same constellation. It does have a bow, just as described, and it's already associated with a crown constellation with the Corona Australis, this is a victor's crown, a conqueror's crown, which is appropriate for the description of the rider on the white horse being a conqueror. It's also given a crown, quote unquote, when the stars made their alignment in the head of the constellation, just as what I showed in Virgo earlier. And then there's one more thing. It's a little hard to see, but right there, that blue text, there's a comet that was also present from our perspective in this constellation at the same time. And the name of the comet is Wierzchos, which is, I believe, a Polish name that translates to first impression. So what you might have there is also a correlation of the first impression of the events of tribulation beginning to unfold, not yet into the 1260-day first half, but the seals beginning to open. So kind of along the same lines, part of the theory here would be that perhaps this is indicating that either the first seal has opened, or it's giving an indication that the timing is imminent, that the first seal is about to open. It's being shown in the sky, and that first seal is the first impression. I could pretty much make an argument for the seal being opened currently, or this being an indication that the first seal is about to be opened. So just worth calling out. I believe this is the last celestial sign concept I wanted to cover, which is in relation to collections of eclipses. So at any given time, most years are going to have one or two lunar eclipses. So any given time, it's not particularly rare to have a lunar eclipse. It becomes more rare when you have a series of lunar eclipses in a row that are of the same type. Particularly when you get to 3 in a row or 4 in a row, that's relatively rare. 4 in a row is called a tetrad, and that will happen somewhere around 6 to 8 times within a 100-year span. So not the most uncommon thing, but also not the rarest thing either. What would make it even more rare is if these eclipses were to also occur consistently on Hebrew holidays. Then it starts to look like maybe it would correlate to that Genesis indication that the things in the sky, including the moon being one of the luminaries, are there for indications of signs and seasons. Now, what I have on the screen here are a couple of examples of sets of eclipses that were the same type that occurred on Hebrew holidays, and there's a little bit of some looseness with that I'll highlight in a second. But first, in the year 32 and 33 AD, which would correlate with the crucifixion, there were 4 partial eclipses in a row with no lunar eclipses in between of a different type, and they fell on Passover and Tabernacles, and then Passover and Tabernacles again for those 2 years. And again, it seems to correlate with the crucifixion. So the sort of rarity of that set of lunar events in the time frame of the crucifixion makes it begin to look a little suspect. There are a number of these. I want to say there's 8 or 9 total between 32, the one that I just highlighted, and the one that's on the far right that I'll get to in a moment. I think there's 8 or 9 that also fall on Hebrew holidays, at least partially, and seem to correlate with major events related to the Jewish people or Israel. I didn't highlight all of them because some of them are very squishy as to whether or not you can count them actually falling on a Hebrew holiday. So I tried to be a little bit of a stickler with it, to really only represent the ones here that I feel are pretty good arguments that they actually fall on Hebrew holidays. Some people were giving, a day, like a 12-hour period of grace, so to speak, of whether or not an eclipse actually fell on the Hebrew holiday or not. I'm not really willing to give as much grace for that because I think that God's more accurate than that. But there are other sets that of blood moons that seem to correlate with major Jewish events. Anyway, the next set that I wanted to highlight is in 1949 and 1950, where again the set of 4 blood moons occurred on Passover and then Tabernacles, then Passover and then Tabernacles. And obviously that's correlating with the time frame immediately following Israel's rebirth. And I think the immediately following part is maybe something significant to highlight. Is I don't think that these are indicating that, hey, if you see this thing, you're going to know the future. I think that instead they correlate to the time frame in which something occurs, or they immediately follow it to kind of give almost like a God's stamp of I did this kind of a thing. We get another one of those in 2014, 2015, which seems to coincide with the beginning of the Gaza war, and we now know how much that has escalated since. But the initial conflict was happening in 2014, 2015, and the blood moons that happened in that time frame happened on unleavened bread, and then tabernacles, then unleavened bread again, and then atonement. So notice how we've kind of shifted forward a little in which Hebrew holidays the moons are falling on as opposed to the previous 2. And the previous 2, it's falling on Passover, which is relevant to the Messiah, and then it's Tabernacles, which is also relevant to the Messiah, with God dwelling with us. Likewise, in 1949-1950, the Tabernacles takes on another God dwelling with us kind of a role in that Israel is established in the Promised Land again. But when we get to the 2014-2015, we're not talking about Passover, and we're not really talking about the Messiah at that point. We're talking about unleavened bread, which is a provision, and then Tabernacles there's still a connection to the dwelling of God or God's people with Tabernacles, but then atonement is introduced, which seems to indicate judgment and presumably some unpleasantness, which definitely came to be with the Gaza war. Now we move kind of into the speculatives that in 2025 and 2026 we've had a triad. It's not a tetrad. That might eliminate it already because these other sets are more rare, being tetrads instead of triads. But what's interesting and very unique about the triad that happened in 2025 and 2026, I did not find another set that fell on Purim except for this set. And the story of Purim is, the story of the Jews effectively being sentenced to mass genocide by the Persians, but then ultimately through a series of events that's a great read. Through a series of events, they're saved by Esther, who convinces the king to pass an additional decree that would allow the Jews to defend themselves, take up arms and defend themselves so that they're not massacred. So this could potentially be kind of in the same vein as the rider on the white horse sign that I mentioned earlier. It might be giving an indication of we're moving into the time frame where the Jews are in trouble and at risk of potentially being massacred or have a massive fatality kind of event that would definitely be associated with the tribulation period. So this might be giving some association with that. And note also that it does coincide directly, a couple of years after the Gaza attack in 2023. So you could make the argument that it does take the same retrospective position, or you can make the argument that it might be foreshadowing events about to take place, depending on which stance you wanted to take there. The last one is a tetrad that will occur in 2032 and 2033. Seems like maybe it would be the end bookend to what began in 32 and 33. because they're exactly 2,000 years apart. The 3233 is associated with the crucifixion. 2032 and 2033 I've already shown to correlate with other reasonings to expect a 7-year tribulation period between now and then. So this would be retroactive to the tribulation period if the aforementioned timing is correct. And then I'll fully admit that this one's a little squishier because second Passover, while biblical, is not a Levitical feast, but that's when the first eclipse is going to occur. The second is going to occur on a Jewish feast or a day of fasting. It's also not a Levitical feast, but it is the anniversary of Rachel's death, which seems significant in the context of the tribulation period. And then you get unleavened bread and atonement. So again, you get kind of a connection to the body of Christ, or provision from God, and then judgment, atonement. So again, I think the blood moon tetrad signs are a pretty squishy thing. I think celestial signs in general are a pretty squishy thing, but there is some correlation to sets of lunar eclipses like this correlating. And a little bit more on the 2032, 2033 is that not just those 4 blood moons, but then the next 2 lunar events also happen to fall on Hebrew feasts. There will be a penumbral eclipse in 2034, which will happen on Passover, and again that's following it happening on Sukkot. And then there will be another partial eclipse that'll happen in 2034, again on Sukkot, which is, we're lining up with tabernacles at that point, dwelling with God. The next thing I'm going to present is a handful of slides that are loose, some looser than others, approaches to patterns that seem to be present in the Bible that would correlate with the timing that I've already communicated. So the first, and one of my favorites, is if you were to look at the Psalms, and specifically Psalms, let's call it 23, really like much stronger if you were to start in like 25 or 26, but I think that the pattern could stretch as far as 23. But start 125, Psalm 125 or Psalm 126, and then read through Psalm 133 to 134, and keep in your mind that each of the chapters correlates to a year in the tribulation period. So 125 would correlate with 2025, 126 would correlate with 2026, etc. And so you would find the end of the tribulation period to be occurring somewhere in the 2033 range, which would be Psalm 133, and you'd have the beginning of the tribulation period occurring somewhere in the 2026 range, which would correlate with Psalm 126. So if you read with that kind of structure, the tribulation period structure in mind, year to chapter, Gregorian year to chapter, then I think that you'll agree that thematically these chapters seem to match up with the pattern of events that are prophesied to occur during the tribulation period. So you sort of get a pattern confirmation that happens to numerically correlate with the Gregorian calendar years that are suspect because of the other logic that's been presented in this video earlier. Likewise, the table at the bottom does a similar thing, but instead it's using the age of Israel, which I already highlighted, having correlation to Jacob. So 2025 to 2026, Israel is 77 years old, so you would look at Psalm 77. The next year, Psalm 78, because Israel will be 78 as of May 15th of 2026. And so on and so forth. You can follow that same pattern all the way up to Psalm 84 or Psalm 85, correlating with Israel being 84 or 85 years old. And it looks to progress from conflict and judgment and idolatry into severe wrath and persecution, and then ultimately into dwelling with God and blessing and pleasantness. So these psalms seem to correlate. The authors of these psalms are highlighted in the text to be prophetic. So it seems that there's a little hidden nugget of pattern in these two sets of psalms for us to find. Similar idea. I have personally found, and I know that there are others that have found things like this too, that the Strong's Concordance, which is a concordance of terms that are found in the original language of the biblical texts, both the Greek and the Hebrew, it seems as though there's some prophetic nature to the concordance and the organization of the original language into an alphabetical structure where you're only incorporating the words that are in the biblical text. And so I've done a couple of different exercises with that, just kind of playing with it, that are represented here. So for example, the top couple of rows here, I used the Gregorian year and then used that as my reference for which word I would pull out of the concordance. And what you get is a similar kind of effect as what I was just describing with the prophetic psalms. There's sort of a pattern that emerges from both the Greek and the Hebrew that seems to roughly correlate with the pattern of the nature of the events that happened in the tribulation. This also occurs if you do a little math and take the numbers from the Gregorian year and multiply them together to get a resulting number, and then you use that as your concordance reference. You'll get a similar pattern, again, both in the Greek and the Hebrew. Likewise, if you take the Hebrew year, and for this I only did the Hebrew because it doesn't really make sense to do the Greek, and it didn't turn out to do the Greek, admittedly. But you can take the Hebrew year and do the same kind of thing that I just did with the Gregorian year, and then use that as Strong's Concordance references to pull a series of words, and then it looks to roughly correlate year to reference, just like the prophetic psalms did, which I think is fascinating. This is a similar kind of approach, but in this I took the number of the Hebrew year, and then I converted that into the Hebrew language. So the fifth letter for the 5,000 mark is He, then 700 would be Zayin, and then the 80 is Chet, and then the 4 in the ones column is Dalet. And so I'm effectively converting the year number into Hebrew letters, is what I'm doing, one number at a time, and then using the symbolic meaning of those letters, the resulting letters, to come up with a symbolic association of the year number to a meaning. And what you get then is the result of the row at the very, very bottom, the colored row. And there's obviously a lot of consistency because the first couple of numbers don't really change, but it's really the last two numbers that do. But the same kind of thing happens. There's sort of a nature to those last couple of meanings that looks to roughly correlate with the Hebrew and Gregorian years that are already in question from those other from the other methodology that I've communicated earlier in the video. One more, and along these lines, is you can also do prime factorization of the Gregorian years, and then use the numbers, the resulting numbers of the prime factorization with numerology associations, which is very similar to what I was just describing with the Hebrew, except for that it's biblical reasoning for numbers being associated with specific things. So, like for example, the number 7 is prevalent throughout the text as a completed set, whereas the number 8 would be the beginning of a new set. So you can kind of have 8 being an association of a new beginning, whereas 7 is an association of completeness or perfection. You can do that with many, all of the numbers. You can find representation in the text, at least anything that's under 100, I've found representation for. And then you can convert that into an associated meaning with individual numbers. It's very squishy, it's very interpretive, but the pattern, if you're consistent and you use the scripture to define what the number significance is, you'll land at interpretations that are roughly akin to what I have at the bottom, and they again kind of match that sort of nature of events that's seem to be indicated or implied to occur during the upcoming Gregorian years, current and upcoming. Now, this last one really blew my mind, and it's very fresh. But what this is I was making a chart to just kind of consolidate the beginning and the end dates for the Millennial Days. So this is the same information as the chart that I presented earlier for the Millennial Days, but I added a couple other significant events in there, and then I recorded the years that those would have occurred, the Gregorian year, and then I recorded the Hebrew year, which they don't actually count back far enough to even get to creation, which is another reason why I feel like the Jews should kind of realize that something's wrong with the way they're counting. But then it occurred to me that, I could do like an actual number of year count from creation all the way through as a result of this. And then it occurred to me, what if I do Strong's references for that year of mankind, just like I was doing with some of those other number interpretations in the previous slides? And when I did, I was flabbergasted at the amount of correlation. So like the very first entry being associated with creation, and the first entries in the two different languages represented in Strong's would tie creation to the Father and also to the first, which makes perfect sense. Likewise, you get my Father is dew, my Father is associated with water, and the people being sanctified kind of in the time frame of between creation and ultimately the flood. So you've got some people are being made holy. The process is beginning of the people being made holy following the initial sin, and I think that's maybe where that consecration is going. The next row, I added in the famine specifically because that seems to be the year in which the Jewish calendar begins, and it does look to correlate with when the 7-year famine occurs that ultimately brings Jacob and Israel into Egypt. And the Strong's correlation there is heard by Yah. It's the name of someone, a Hebrew name that translates to heard by Yah or heard by God. And then you've also got the Greek associated with a foreigner or a stranger belonging to another, which is a perfect correlation to Jacob going into Egypt. He doesn't belong there. He's a foreigner that's having to go to Egypt to be saved from the famine. I need to move a little faster on this, I'm realizing, but the beginning of day 2 correlates with Noah and the flood, and what we have there in the one previous, which is the year, it would be the year before the flood, I think. You've got Greek for buthos, which is buthizo, which is to sink or to plunge or to submerge, so deep association of water. The very next one is buthos, which is also associated with the depths and the deep and the abyss. I don't really know what to do with the house of the rampart, but the house of dust makes sense in the context of the first millennial day because the house of Adam is the house of dust. Adam is made from dust. So you've kind of got a couple of different correlations there that seem to make sense. The end of day 2 has the tower up for the Hebrew, which is potentially a reference to the Tower of Babel. EPN doesn't really make sense to me in this context. But then, in day 3, where God is starting to become involved with Abram and starting to establish Israel, you get consecrated and set apart, and you get being in love and desire, which, kind of alludes to the marriage ideas that I was communicating earlier. Then at the end of this day, in association with the end of David's reign and the beginning of Solomon's reign, you get thankful. But then you also get stoning or being killed by a stone, which would correlate pretty well with David, who's most widely known for killing Goliath with a stone and a sling. Then you got Solomon's reign beginning day 4, and you get the word wise in the Hebrew, knowing or acknowledging or wisdom, which is definitely associated with Solomon. I moved to Jesus' birth, and you get the Hebrew word for spring or fountain, Jesus being the living water, and then you get the number 5 in word form, and 5 numerologically is associated with redemption and grace. You'd have to find that, and I'd have to show you in the text to justify that fully, but you just have to take my word for it on that, I guess. Crucifixion and the end of day 4, you get Megor Misabib, which is terror on every side. And in the Greek, you get Perilupos, which is deeply distressed or sorrowful. Like, what are the odds that you would get that specifically for the entry for the crucifixion? The parts for the church age don't make quite as much sense to me. I need to spend some more time with them, but just included them for the sake of completing the table. But I admit that I don't actually have a good correlation for the day 5 and day 6 ones, except when you get to day 6 for the trib end, and trib start for that matter too, because I used the 26 and 32 dates that I've already supported elsewhere. You get to answer or to testify, which would make sense in the context of the tribulation period, and then also at the end you get born, as in fruit. So there's production of fruit that then occurs, which is exactly what is expected to occur for Israel once they've seen the error of their ways as it relates to accepting Jesus as the Messiah. So again, we get another perfect lineup, and I didn't handpick these. Like, this is just correlating to the number of years since creation based off of the biblical account of years, and then all the other justifications that I've given as far as like trib timing and crucifixion timing, that sort of thing. Last one, in day 7, it starts with humility and meekness in the Hebrew, which we know the meek will inherit the earth, right? So that seems to give an indication that the meek would be involved in inheriting the earth during the millennial reign. And finally, the last one, at the end of the 7th millennial day, is kala, which is to roast or to burn, which would have a direct correlation to the current heaven and earth passing away in fire, and then the new heaven and the new earth being formed, which is prophesied to occur at the very end of the 7th millennial day. So that just, like I said, completely stunned me to see that many entries correlate appropriately to the time and the events of the times. It sure looks like God's design evident in the words that are used in the text to ultimately result in a concordance that could produce these kind of results. Looks like the fingerprint of God to me. Okay, the last thing to cover is the current events and how they look to align with prophetic events in the Bible. Starting with Jeremiah 49, we have a prophecy against Elam found in verses 34 through 39. Elam is modern-day southwestern Iran. And the prophecy states that God is going to break the bow of Elam, which would indicate a removal of military capability, probably in association with ranged military capability like rockets and missiles. This is the explicit reason why the United States and Israel have gone into conflict with Iran is that they were developing and continue to try to develop nuclear and ballistic capabilities. And the United States and Israel decided that that threat was large enough that it was existential for Israel, and therefore a military strike was necessary when diplomatic means failed. So that's what we have been seeing progressively happening now for the last few weeks as these strikes have gone on, is they're systematically removing the military capabilities of Iran, and in particular are targeting ranged capabilities to remove them as a threat to the nations around them. This prophecy also states that the people in Elam will be scattered, that there will be no nation in the world that doesn't have some of their people scattered to them. What this seems to indicate is that there will be some kind of a humanitarian disaster or issue that happens specifically in southwestern Iran that causes the requirement of people to be evacuated. This could come in a couple of different forms. Iran has been struggling for years now with water supply and potentially having enough water to supply and sustain their people. So you could have a humanitarian crisis as it relates to water that suddenly means that people just have to leave because they can't be sustained by the resources that are available to them. The same is true for food. Iran has a food scarcity problem that is significantly worse because of the conflict and specifically because of the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. A lot of their food comes through that strait. And so for them to have to close it for military purposes is to the detriment of their people and could potentially cause humanitarian disaster, which would therefore likely include Elam. Jeremiah 49 also prophesies that Elam's kings and officials will be removed and destroyed, actually, and that God will set his throne in Elam. So what I think that indicates is first that the ruling class, the ruling group, will be eliminated, which is exactly what we've seen over the last few weeks. The strikes have targeted military capabilities and also the leaders that have failed to come to a diplomatic resolution of this problem. So effectively, the United States and Israel have been aiming for regime change as part of their military tactics. This is exactly what Jeremiah 49 says will happen, and that ultimately that regime will be removed entirely, and that instead a new ruling group will be implemented instead. And the implication of Jeremiah 49 is that the ruling class or group that ultimately gets established is the one that God has chosen to be the ruling group moving forward. Finally, consider that as we see this prophecy fulfilling in real time, we can look at the next prophecy, the associated prophecies that are also in that chapter, and the next prophecy in the next chapter to get an indication of the timing of when the next things would occur and what those next things are. The next chapter is Jeremiah 50, and Jeremiah 50 is specifically prophecy against Babylon, which directly correlates to Revelation 17 through 19 prophecy against Babylon and the whore of Babylon. This is, like Elam, symbolic of a particular territory, area of the world, and I go into a lot more detail as far as that's concerned on my website and in previous videos. But what I'm really trying to say now for this slide is that because we see fulfillment of Jeremiah 49, it's logical that the next chapter could then occur chronologically. So as we see Jeremiah 49 begin to wrap up, we would potentially see Jeremiah 50 start. And Jeremiah 50 is in the tribulation period. It aligns with prophecies that are absolutely in the tribulation period. So the implication is that as we see Jeremiah 49 wrapping up, we have reason to believe that the tribulation period would then be imminent. A couple other prophecies along in this chapter and along these lines. Damascus being destroyed is mentioned in verse 23 and 27, and that correlates also with Isaiah 17:1, which explicitly states that Damascus will no longer be a city. It will be destroyed, complete and total destruction. That has never happened in the past, and so therefore this prophecy is still active, and it's in the chapter that we're seeing currently fulfilled in current events. So my expectation is that conflict at some point, maybe even into the tribulation period, that the conflict would expand into Damascus. This is also significant because there are prophecies in Islam that also correlate with conflict, specifically in Syria and involving Damascus, that are part of their eschatological prophecies. And I cover that a little bit more on my website and in a previous video, and I'm going to cover it a little bit more on an upcoming slide. But all I'll say right now is that expansion into Damascus fits prophecies, end times prophecies, for both the Bible and Islam. And it seems to be correlated with the fulfillment that we're currently seeing in Jeremiah 49 because it's included in verse 23 through 27. Last one is Ephraim. I've already mentioned this, but the territory that's directly north of Jerusalem is prophesied to be invaded at some point. And likewise, in Revelation 11, you find that it's prophesied that the city and the temple mount will be trampled by Gentiles. The implication is trampled by foreigners. That could either be invasion or potentially a peacekeeping force that's been stationed in Jerusalem for one reason or another. There's a couple of different ways of how that could potentially play out, but the ultimate implication here is that there would be military forces that are not Israel's, that are in those territories, Ephraim, which is directly north of Jerusalem, and then also in Jerusalem itself. This would also potentially have ties to, like Ezekiel 38 and 39, which is a conflict against Israel, where many of the surrounding nations, very specific list of nations, are aligned together and moving against Israel. So you could potentially see the Ephraim territory invaded as a result of that, and you would get fulfillment of multiple prophecies at the same time. Moving on. In Matthew 24, verses 6 through 8, Jesus states that the end times will be prefaced by wars and rumors of wars. And he specifically states that nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. So not just that there will be rumors of those things, but that it will actually come to pass. That's in verse 8 specifically, that it says it's going to happen. It's not just going to be a rumor or an indication, but it's going to take place. So what this kind of means then is we've already seen some fulfillment of this with World War I and World War II, and that ultimately progressed into the reestablishment of Israel as a nation, which is also found in Matthew 24 as one of the indicators that Jesus gives, as the fig tree. I already mentioned that as well. So we're already seeing wars and rumors of wars. We're already seeing Matthew 24 being fulfilled. It's in progress since then, since the world wars and since Israel becoming a nation again. But there are other prophecies, including in Matthew 24, but there are other prophecies that are also indicating that additional conflict on a world scale is going to take place. The two that I think are most compelling are actually the two bullets at the bottom. So maybe I should have put these in a different order. But first, in Revelation 6, seal 2, the rider on the red horse is said to be given a great sword and given the power to take peace from the earth and to cause man to slay man. This indicates global war, global conflict, and that's absolutely something that's in the future because it's associated with seal 2 in Revelation 6. I already previously mentioned that I think that there might be a celestial sign that indicates that seal 1 has already been opened. So the indication to me would be that seal 2 could potentially be very imminent. When I mentioned seal 1, hopefully you recall that I did also say that it might just be an indication that we're approaching the season or the time frame in which seal 1 occurs. It could be a preface sign rather than a it's happening right now sign. I could make an argument either way. But regardless, it would be an indication that the seals are either in the process of being opened or they are about to be opened. And seal 2 is world conflict. Likewise, Daniel 7, which I cover in much more detail in a previous video talking about prophetic beasts, Daniel 7's interpretation later in the chapter that's given by an angel indicates that the beasts that are spoken of are kingdoms or governments or nationalities that immediately come before the millennial reign. That fourth beast in particular is immediately before the millennial reign, and that's confirmed in Revelation 19 and 20. There's correlation there, and that beast is also the same beast of Revelation 13. Again, I do all this in much greater detail in my previous video. If you're interested in that, take a look at that. I'm 100% confident that all those things connect together. But as far as the sake of this slide is concerned, the beasts in Daniel 7 first mention a lion with eagle's wings, which I believe to be symbolic of Israel, the lion. They identify themselves as the lion in various ways, and it's also identified as such in the Bible. And then I believe that the eagle's wings are actually indicating the alliance between Israel and the United States that we're currently seeing in play. The wings symbolically indicating the capability that's being provided from the United States to Israel, particularly in the form of military air support, fighter jets and bombers and things like that, military strikes. That's what's happening, and that's the kind of alliance that we've seen be the case for the United States and Israel for some time now. The lion prophecy ends with the wings being plucked from the lion. So the implication there is that at some point that alliance is going to break, either for political reasons or for military reasons. That's going to be removed from the lion at some point. The next beast, I'm not going to do all of them in this video, but the next beast is also applicable to what I was just saying, which is the bear. The bear is told to rise and eat its fill of flesh. So again, this gives an indication that a kingdom or a nation is told to rise and then engage in military conflict. So that seems to correlate with everything else that I've just said. And the bear, the most natural symbolic correlation to the bear for the nations of the world would be Russia. And there's plenty of argument to be made of how Russia might rise into a larger military conflict in potentially different ways. So that's another thing that I'm looking to see come to pass as I speculate that the lion and eagle's wings is already being fulfilled in our headlines today. Check out my previous video on more info regarding the beasts. I'll have a link in the description. Moving on, another current event is the development of artificial intelligence and robotics in a broader scale. Generally speaking, the powers that be, the tech giants of the world, are indicating that we're either moving towards destruction enabled by artificial intelligence and robotics. There's warnings associated with this technology, while others are saying that we're moving towards utopia. Now, if you take a biblical perspective, utopia is not where we're heading, right? I don't want to be the bearer of bad news. I don't want to be negative Nancy or whatever, pessimist. But one of the things that AI and robotics is doing is it's reducing the amount of necessary work for mankind. But in Genesis, God curses mankind to work as part of the consequence of sin. So that alone would be an indication that the idea that we're moving towards a man-made, man-designed utopia is unlikely. Apart from God, at least, God needs to intervene and do something else to establish something along those lines. Another thing that's kind of along that same line of thinking is I wanted to compare artificial intelligence to the Industrial Revolution for a moment. If you consider the Industrial Revolution, factories were being developed in the early 20th century, allowing for mass production of all kinds of things, processing of food, production of machinery parts to then develop into cars and planes and everything else. But effectively, as we learned to make machines that could make things, we learned how to produce more in less time. We had a lot more efficiency, but there was still a human element that was required. The Industrial Revolution, as a result, produced jobs, and it produced more goods and allowed for more services, and effectively everyone, the world in general, became wealthier for it. But man still had active purpose within that type of a system. AI is also bringing in efficiencies and should result in greater supply and greater provision for mankind. That's the utopia perspective. But the distinct difference between what's happening with technology today versus what happened with the Industrial Revolution is it is eliminating the human element. It's removing mankind as a necessary component for these systems to take place. And in doing so, it's removing the value that a large portion of the world population brings to the economy and to society. Now, there's still other value that could potentially be brought, but we're, as a result of this movement, which cannot be stopped, apart from God's intervention, the net result of this is that AI is going to bring about massive societal and economic changes. It's just inevitable because of the nature of what it's doing, and businesses are incentivized to leverage it or fail. So there's nothing to hold it back. It's going to happen. The question is will it be destructive in nature, or would it bring about some form of other changes to our society to where we're living in a much more different and distinct way from the way that we're living right now? Because the Bible is the source of truth, I then look at the Bible for the answer to that question. And what I find is that what's prophesied in the end times is that there will be a massive international system of integrated systems involving the economy, involving the military, involving the administration, the governing bodies. They will all be integrated together, and there will be an integration with a religious component, and that all of that will be associated with a system of the beast in Revelation 13. And it will be required for people to opt into this system in a way that is also a form of worship, which will condemn them in the process. But they won't be able to partake in economic practices or a variety of other things if they're not engaged in this system. Which, again, if you're watching this video and you have a system like that happening, you do not want to get involved with that. The Bible explicitly states that the people who take the mark of the beast are condemned. At any rate, so it seems to me that we're moving towards that kind of a reality, and that's exactly what prophecy indicates will happen. One more thing that I wanted to say on that is that in regards to eliminating the human element, AI and robotics are increasingly becoming self-iterative and self-sufficient. Robots can repair each other, they can change out their own batteries, they can charge themselves, they can monitor their own systems and monitor the systems of other robots around them. Likewise, AI can automate a lot of those systems on the software side, and AI can now be agentic, where you can have an instance of AI functioning that can create other instances of AI. It can examine its own code and propose revisions and improvements to its own code. So these things can now develop themselves. Robots likewise are beginning to be used more and more in factory settings for manufacturing purposes. They're being used for resource gathering. So there isn't really much standing in the way at this point of AI and robotics being able to complete the entire self-iteration system without the need of human intervention at all. What that then implies is that it's its own kind of force at that point. If it ever were to have control over those various stages in any capacity, it would then be able to self-improve and self-develop. And what you have then is sort of a subculture in Earth that is able to build and develop itself and start to establish its own destiny. So the Bible doesn't say anything about something like that happening. The implication is that other prophetic events happen first, to where we don't get to a reality like that, but we do get to a reality where mankind is leveraging technologies like this in order to establish global control and oppression, particularly against the saints, which is again found in Revelation 13. All right, I've hammered that one enough. Moving on. One of the things that is a consistent theme in end times prophecy is economic and agricultural fallout. I've already mentioned what's happening in the Middle East, that the conflict there could cause larger problems for the countries in the Middle East specifically, but also for the world. The Strait of Hormuz is a major lane for trade for the entire world. particularly in fuel and food. So the closing of that strait, the conflict that's happening there, that would potentially have the result of causing scarcity, and therefore causing regulation and rationing and all kinds of other things to potentially happen as a result, and probably other conflict as people start to have to grapple with not having the things that they need. I just recently read, for example, that there are hundreds of gas stations in Australia that don't have fuel at the moment to distribute to the population. That can very quickly escalate into a much larger problem, as we all know that we are pretty reliant on fuels for the goings on of our world. Another thing that's happening here with the Strait of Hormuz is that it's having a negative impact on the fertilizer supply, and we are in the sowing season right now. So if fertilizers are scarce and it doesn't get applied to the planted crop, you potential for crop failure, or at least for not nearly as much volume to be produced, which would then contribute to a food scarcity problem. It would contribute to higher prices, inflation, and it could potentially contribute to a wider scale famine or starvation problem. And that happens to be part of the seals in Revelation 6 also. So it appears the world is moving in that direction, and that is thematically included in end times prophecies, specifically at the beginning of tribulation. Quickly, as far as world governance is concerned, I've kind of already mentioned that like AI is kind of playing a part in this to some degree, but we see development as it relates to the United Nations now being kind of in direct competition with the Board of Peace. Trump has been moving the United States away from involvement with the UN and NATO more and more, not entirely, but moving away more and more. And now he's established a completely different administrative group that is international in nature and has the potential to be in direct competition, so to speak, with the United States. I actually think that this could be the early stages of the development of the Revelation 13 beast, which in my prophetic beasts I go into more detail about, so I won't hit that too hard right now because I'm using too much time. BRICS has been around for a while. It's a an economic alliance, strategic alliance of nations intended to compete with the United States, the U.S. dollar in particular, but also to compete in other areas and other ways. So we've got competition happening there. There's progression happening there. Cryptocurrencies, both from the technological perspective that I mentioned earlier with AI and robotics, cryptocurrency would also play a role in that. We are seeing cryptocurrency and AI systems being integrated in banks, and they're being staged while waiting for governmental regulation. But these kinds of systems are being integrated, and what we're moving towards again is a fully integrated digital world, both economically, militarily, and probably administratively, at least to some degree. And prophecy supports that notion. Other bodies, organizational, administrative bodies, the World Economic Forum looks to be an international collaboration of wealthy people and businesses that are working to affect policy, administrative policy. Likewise, the World Health Organization kind of had a lot more power when COVID happened, and we have them and other quote-unquote experts warning of inevitable additional pandemics. So at some point, they believe there's going to be additional problems along those lines, and I actually do too, but not because they're warning about it, but rather because illness, mass illness, is also included as part of the seals at the beginning of tribulation. So I would expect that there would be something along those lines be coming down the pipe. The last thing as far as current events is concerned is the Muslim movement. I'm sure that no one has missed that there is a progression of support for the Muslim world, for Islam in general. There has been years and years of immigration into Western culture in particular, but also elsewhere, that has resulted in culture conflict. These are actually part of core principles of Islam. Islam teaches, in a similar vein to Christianity, that Islam is to act as in a missionary capacity to try to spread their belief system throughout the world. A distinction, though, is that Islam also includes jihad. So if a people group does not convert, then it is supported in the text that Islam would at some point look to conquest that people group and effectively either force conversion or eliminate a people group that's believing something contrary to them. Now, not every Muslim is going to agree with what I just said, but it is in the text. Whether or not you want to take that extreme of a view or not is on an individual basis. We see this politically happening too with the question of the Palestine territory and whether or not a portion of Israel should be divided out and given to another people group. We also see, the Gaza conflict on the world stage being a motivator, and really the two sides in opposition are Israel, which is largely the Jews, versus the Muslim nations in the surrounding area. That not all of them support Hezbollah, the group that's been being attacked in Gaza and that did attack. But there's still a connection here, effectively, between the Jews and the Muslims, and conflict is only likely to continue because what we know about the belief systems of Islam versus Christianity versus Judaism is Islam teaches that it's a greater revelation, an additional revelation to Christianity and therefore to Judaism. They believe that they're being led by God to do the things that they're doing. This includes the extreme groups that are doing terrorism. This is going to continue, and it's actually a very dangerous thing because it's a mixing of oil and water because they're opposing views. It's a mixing of oil and water to have Muslim people migrating into non-Muslim areas because of their religious views. The non-Muslim people are happy to welcome Muslims into their communities because they're wanting to integrate and diversify, especially in the United States. We're the big melting pot, right? Like, everybody's welcome as long as you want to be a contributing member of society. The trouble becomes that every single people group, including but not limited to the Muslims, are looking to influence the culture based off of their culture. It's not really an integration, it's more of an intention of influence. And we're seeing some violent and dramatic results of that in places like Britain, for example, where they have a very large portion of the Muslim population in particular parts of the country, and violence and protesting and all kinds of things along those lines have been occurring. We're starting to see some of that in the United States. Michigan is a hotspot, for example, which has a very high Muslim population, and then different places in New England, a similar vein. So why I highlight all this is not to be a racist, I guess, or just generally against anyone that is a Muslim, though I believe that they're deceived and that I believe that Islam is false. But I'm stating it because what I see in end times prophecy is that there's prophecy in multiple instances of conflict between Muslim nations and the Jews and the Christians. And the Muslims also believe, the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims all believe that there are signs in the current events, like what I've illustrated here, that indicate that the end times prophecies are coming to fulfillment. So the Muslims also believe that their Messiah is imminent and that the end times prophecies being fulfilled is imminent. One of the things that I highlight in a previous video is that Muslim end times prophecies actually look to overlap and have very many similarities to the false prophet and the Antichrist that's described in Revelation 13. Particularly in the oppression and mass slaughter of believers that's prophesied in Revelation 13. I go into a lot more detail on it, but the main thing that I would want to highlight here and that I highlight in the other video, is that the Muslims are expecting a resurrected Jesus to return with their Messiah, but they're expecting Jesus to come as a prophet, because that's what they teach, is that Jesus was a prophet. This is directly aligned with the description of the false prophet in Revelation 13. Two leaders, a Messiah, a Muslim Messiah, and a resurrected Jesus, leading a religious group that leads the world to worship the beast, the larger international governing body that has military and economic influence over the globe. This seems to directly correlate. And again, I go into a lot more detail in my previous video. It's not the only way that Revelation 13 could potentially be fulfilled, but it seems the most likely way. And I present all of that in my previous video more. But the purpose of including it here is that it's a continued movement and escalation that's been present in the news and in headlines and world events for years. And it seems to be progressing towards end times prophecies. All right, so in summary, what I'm trying to do with this video is just give kind of an exhaustive list as best I can of everything that would come to my memory when making the list, of how it's not just one particular thing that is leading me to believe that the end times are imminent, but it's actually a culmination of a lot of different things that are to be considered in consideration of each other. How likely is it that all of the things that I just described are all kind of generally pointing to the same time frame, the imminent future, the near future? How likely is it that all of those things seem to be pointing in the same general time frame, and that other people also believe that end times prophecies are pointing to the same general time frame for different reasons? How likely is it that all of that aligns and it's not true? Very unlikely, right? And so what I've covered here is specific measurement of time in the Bible that seems to point to the imminent, current, or near future time frame. The Bible indicating that Israel's revival and movement towards prophetic fulfillment is a sign that we're moving towards that end. Celestial signs that are squishier or more prone to interpretation, but also look to line up with the same time frame, and with some events that are extremely unique and singular in a couple of instances. There's also deeper patterns that I agree are very highly interpretive, but there are other patterns in the scripture and associated texts like the Strong's Concordance, and an argument to be made of there are patterns there that look to match with the timing, and they look to have direct association with the current year and the upcoming years, both for the Gregorian year and also for the Hebrew year. And then finally, the current events, just generally speaking, current events for the world look to be moving toward an alignment with what biblical prophecy says. And that prophecy was written thousands of years ago. So the culmination of all of these things seems to indicate that there's multiple confirmations of the timing being very short. So the message then for this video is that the Bible is true. You can see that the Bible is true, evidenced in that all of these things match, and that all of it was presented thousands of years ago, and that there are thousands of records that indicate that the text did not change from when it was originally written to now. So we are seeing biblical prophecy being fulfilled. It's an evidence that the Bible is true. The Bible teaches that Jesus is the only way to salvation, that what God has been doing since the creation of the world is working against sin to ultimately resolve it and restore mankind into direct fellowship with God once again, in the same way that is described in Genesis, where God is dwelling with man in the garden. We're moving back to that. This entire process has been God creating the world and then resolving the issue of evil and sin so that mankind can then dwell with God in perfect union, sinless, righteous union forevermore. That's what the Bible teaches. And the fact that the prophecies that are in the Bible are coming to fulfillment is evidence that all of that is true. And therefore, anyone that hears this message needs to hear that you need to align your life with the teachings of the Bible. You need to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, you need to apply the principles and the teachings of the Bible to your life. You need to be expectant of Jesus to return, because all of those things are true, and it's evidenced in the things that I've just showed you, and many other things that I have on my website and in my other videos. So, the only other thing that I'll say is that there's no other sign to be given. All that's left is to see what prophecy is already being fulfilled, be fulfilled in completion, and then to see the rapture occur, to see the tribulation period begin. The implication is that the period of grace is about to end. The church age is about to end. The end times prophecies are about to begin. And that has implications to every living person on this planet. So please give this careful consideration and make your choice. I pray that God blesses you, and I pray that this information has blessed you.